Hello, and thank you for choosing this full-length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn.
Chapter 1. Despair hung over the MacPherson's household like dark clouds just before a downpour. Except in this case, the downpour had already happened. Tragedy had already struck. The house was silent. There was no melodious hum of a piano, no playful laughter, and no arguing over a game. The sisters passed by each other in the hallway, up and down the stairs, and near the study where they couldn't yet summon the courage to enter. "I can't believe he's gone," Rose, the youngest, said, staring at the door leading to the room their father had spent many nights in. "I feel like some minutes from now he'll step out and say, 'Another round of chess, Rose?'" Her voice shook, and tears streamed down her face. Minnie reached out to embrace her. Rose's strawberry blonde hair tickled her nose, and she soothed her sister's grief, even as she struggled against her own. "It still doesn't feel real." Minnie glanced up to see her twin sister, Annie. Annie's dark eyes held Minnie's, filled with unfathomable sadness. Her eyes were wet and red-rimmed, unlike Minnie's. A week had passed since they'd received news of their father's passing, and she hadn't been able to shed a tear. Her grief was bundled like a hard knot in her chest, and she could hardly speak for fear that she might burst. She shut her eyes, feeling the warmth of Annie's hand on her arm. It seemed it had happened just yesterday. They'd been sitting in the parlor, indulging in their favorite pastimes. Annie had been playing the piano, while Minnie had been playing chess with Rose. Florence, the eldest, had stomped out of the kitchen, complaining that no one was assisting her with preparing dinner. Minnie had been poking fun at her when the door had burst open, and a neighbor had stepped in. Minnie had taken one look at his somber expression and known. Something terrible had happened. She'd felt the premonition all day, but she'd shrugged it off, wishing not to dwell on it. "Your father's dead," the bearer of bad tidings had said. His next words had sounded like a faraway echo. He'd spoken strings of words that had failed to penetrate the haze Minnie had found herself in. Half an hour later, she'd floated down to earth somewhat and understood. "A docking accident," he'd said. Her kind, warm father had died in a docking accident. A lump formed in her throat. As the minutes passed, the others joined them. Polly, Helen, Winifred. Their faces were similar. They all shared the slender figure of their ma, with hair colors ranging from strawberry blonde to dark brown. Their eyes held the same fathomless grief. The six sisters stood in front of the study, forming a chain of women grieving for the man they loved the most. "He's in a better place," Polly said, mostly to Rose. Her words didn't make Minnie feel any better. Father wouldn't have wanted to be in a better place. He'd have wanted to be with them. He'd have wanted to stay until they all had families of their own, and he could, as he often said, play games with their wee ones. "Dinner's ready." The eldest, Florence, stood at the base of the stairs. She was dark-haired and tall like the twins, but that was where the resemblance stopped. Florence's oval face was so much like their mother's. In many ways, Florence acted like the mother of the house, although she was only 4 years older than the twins. Perhaps that was why she took their mother's passing to heart. She'd been old enough to watch it all unfold. So had Minnie and Annie and Helen and Winnie. Only Polly and Rose, who had been too young to grasp the incident, had been spared much of the pain. Their kind father had been the most affected. His wife's death had struck him like a hard bow, and he'd become a shell of his former self. The children had been raised by housekeepers and nannies while he'd poured himself into his work. Then, a few years later, another woman had come into their home in a whiz of strong perfume and large smiles. And she'd left just as quickly, with a chunk of their wealth and the broken pieces of Peter MacPherson's heart. Water under the bridge, Minnie told herself, as the memories of the past threatened to drown her. There was so much happening now that it was folly to dwell on the cold, dark past, and now their source of hope and light was gone. The future suddenly seemed bleak, filled with uncertainty and fear on Minnie's part. She held her twin sister's gaze, and she knew Annie felt her fear. They all did, but no one spoke of it. "None of us has had a proper meal in a while," Helen said. "We need our strength." The sisters moved as a unit to the dinner table, where Florence had meticulously arranged the food. They all stared at the chair at the head of the table, where their father had sat for several meals. There was an empty plate before it. "To honor Father, and pray we always feel his presence despite his absence," Florence said wisely. Her voice shook on the last word, and Minnie offered her a small smile. Florence was only pretending to be strong for all of them. She wondered how many hours Florence spent crying into her pillow at night while she stared at the ceiling, numb. "Father's favorite," Helen said, staring dismally at the food. Minnie took a forkful of the food in her mouth. The flavors exploded on her tongue, and she felt a spasm of delight. She'd almost forgotten how good food tasted. Everything had been gray and bland since they'd received news of their father's death. "Do you remember when Father brought a guest home unannounced?" Winifred said halfway into the meal. "I think Father hoped he'd hit it off with Florence, and they'd have a great big romance." Annie giggled, and they all turned to look at Florence, who didn't like to be reminded of Father's failed attempt at playing matchmaker. She'd been so embarrassed that she'd retired to bed before dinner had ended. The very next day, she'd warned them all never again to speak of it again. But they still mentioned the incident when Florence was too far away to hear. Seeing their calm and controlled sister rattled wasn't something that happened every day. His only wish was for us to find men that would genuinely love us. Polly's words quietened them. Their laughter died. Once again, heaviness descended on them. It was too soon to make jest of the funny memories. Far too soon. He'd just been laid to rest, and the black they wore wouldn't be laid aside any time soon. "What will happen to us?" Rose glanced at Minnie, asking the question they'd all been thinking for the past week. "Will we be kicked out?" A heavy silence hung over the room. Their father had owned the house, but in his absence they had no idea what would happen. None of them were engaged to be married, and they had no brother to take over their father's business. "Cousin Geoffrey," Minnie spat out the name, and they all stiffened. They had a collective loathing for their pompous, greedy cousin. Even Father hadn't been fond of him. Geoffrey had always been at loggerheads with him and had spent many a time arguing with Peter MacPherson behind closed doors. Although none of the sisters had been told what they were arguing about, they had a feeling it had to do with a piece of land their father had kept and had refused to sell. Peter had always been stressed and irritated after each encounter. It didn't help that Geoffrey had convinced him to marry again after their mother's death, which had only been a plot to rob him of his possessions, and of course he'd wiggled his way out of accepting blame. Someone knocked on the door. Florence shot to her feet. "I'll get it," Minnie said without thinking, and hurried to the door. She wasn't sure why, but she had an inkling their question was about to be answered, and it wasn't going to be pleasant. She opened the door. Cousin Geoffrey's pudgy face loomed into view. He'd grown larger since she'd last seen him. His ginormous tummy, caused by his grotesque eating habits, hung over his frame like an overinflated balloon. His face was red and puffy, and he wiped off the sweat from his brow with a stained handkerchief. He looked nothing like his father, who was said to be similar to theirs in appearance. "Ah, Helen." He peered at her with beady eyes. "All grown up, I see." Minnie didn't bother to correct him. She glanced behind him to the shiny new carriage and uniformed servant who was carrying trunks out of the vehicle. He hadn't come here to visit. Geoffrey brushed past her. "I have some important news." Distaste rose from the pit of her belly, and she had to bite her lip to prevent the hurl of words from spewing from her lips. He'd expressed no sympathy for their father's death. He hadn't even shown up for the funeral. She stared at the folds of fat at the back of his head with barely concealed dislike. He'd betrayed her father and now had the guts to waltz into the house like he owned it. Smoothing her black dress, she inhaled deeply to calm herself. Then she followed him to the parlor, where the sisters were already gathered. They must have heard his voice and prepared themselves for the worst. None of them were in the least bit pleased by Geoffrey's presence. He seemed completely oblivious to their animosity. He swept the sisters with his gaze before turning to inspect the parlor. He peered at a painting of their pa, which hung above the fireplace. Gone too soon. His tone was flat and devoid of sympathy. He turned to the sisters. "Since I'm the closest relative to your father, I will be taking over his estate. I'm certain he'd prefer I take care of his daughters on his behalf." His lips spread, and it was more a sneer than a smile. "I have good news for you, as you'll soon see." His feet were planted wide apart, his pudgy arms behind his back. He paced in front of them, snapping his head up at regular intervals to ensure they were paying rapt attention. He spoke to them like a general speaking to an army of soldiers. He'd served in the army, a fact he mentioned often, lest they forgot how important he was. "While I served in the army," Minnie stifled a groan, "I met good men and sons of good men, men that made good soldiers, and later, good businessmen and lawyers and accountants." His gaze settled on Minnie, "men that would make good husbands." Oh no. Minnie wanted to sink into the floor and disappear, or grab Geoffrey by the scruff of his overpriced suit and drag him out of their house. Since she could do neither, she stood with her sisters and listened wordlessly as he told them of his plans. "I must ensure you all marry well." His announcement was met with shocked silence. "You're all old enough to—" "Rose is only 16, Minnie cut in, irritated. Geoffrey's eyes narrowed. "Don't interrupt me again." Minnie scowled at him. She didn't flinch from his stare. When he saw she wouldn't back down, he looked away and continued his ridiculous pacing. "I hope my uncle hasn't left a stone unturned in training you to be good wives and mothers." He paused, searching the air for words. "I shall tell you more in a few days." He waved a hand in dismissal. "You can go." None of them moved a muscle. Rose clung to Florence, her lips wobbling ever so slightly. Minnie felt a surge of anger as she watched her little sister. Their father had never forced his will on them. He'd never wanted to force them into marriage, ever. She opened her mouth to speak, but Florence shot her a look. Biting her lip, she clamped her words down. Whatever she said now would only make things worse for them. "You can go," Geoffrey said again. One by one, the sisters left the parlor. Minnie was the last to go. She gave Geoffrey a long, heated stare and made a silent vow. She'd rather die than bend to his rule. Chapter 2. After a hard day's work, a trip to the tavern's the best way to end the day. Edward emitted a long, satisfied sigh. "Good whiskey." Benjamin chuckled, raising a mug to his lips. The ale cascaded down his throat in a fiery trail. The heady feel of the alcohol calmed and spread warmth through him. His body ached and he felt heavy with worries. He'd spent the whole day hammering away with little to show for it despite his efforts. And he'd do the same again tomorrow. And the next. And the next. His already sunken spirits sunk lower and he asked for another serving. A mug of ale later, he felt lighter. Freer. "Does a job as a furniture repairer pay more than mining?" Benjamin shook his head, staring dismally at the men in the tavern. Men of different professions, carpenters, blacksmiths, shop owners, gamblers, lawmen, all sat singly or in groups, there to end the day with a mug of alcohol. The men spoke in a loud rumble, and someone staggered and knocked a bar stool over with a clang. Drunken eyes focused on Benjamin's before dancing away to the rest of the tavern. Benjamin and his friend watched the man stagger away, fated to fall asleep in a gutter somewhere. He'd be lucky if he woke up with his possessions intact. He grimaced and took another sip of his drink. "It pays little," he said in response to Edward's question. "I thought becoming my own employer would open a world of good. It hasn't." Disappointment shone in his voice. The past week hadn't been as good as he'd hoped. Edward patted his arm. "Don't despair, my friend." He gestured to the barman. "One more serving of red eye. Slow down on the drinking, will you? Elizabeth won't take kindly to you going home staggering like a drunk." Edward ignored his warning. "Bring another for my dear old friend Ben." A mug was placed before him. Benjamin stared suspiciously at the drink, wondering how Edward would be able to afford all the drinks. He was still working in the mining company Ben had been working at for years before he'd quit and began working as a furniture repairer. "What are we celebrating? Is Elizabeth expecting another child?" Edward placed a cup on the table with a clang. He barked a laugh, shaking his head. "She's put her foot down and insists on not havin' more children?" Says we're hardly getting lit by as it is. All that ends soon. A week from now, she'll be singing a different tune. A different tune, I tell you. Benjamin was more than a little amused by his friend's words. What's happening in a week? You'd strike gold? He'd meant the words in jest, but Edward's expression changed, and he leaned towards Benjamin. I? He glanced around the tavern. I'm getting a new job. A job? And not the type I'll spend all day sweating on for meager pay, either. It's a one-time job. Everything happened like a dream. Like a dream. Benjamin was even more interested in his friend's story. Edward's words were slurred. The alcohol was getting to him. He leaned in again, and his voice dropped to a whisper. Benjamin had to strain his ears to hear him. Someone walked up to me and asked if I'd like to work for Don Crawford. Benjamin's mouth fell open. The gang? Edward raised the mug to his lips. He took several gulps while Benjamin waited impatiently for him to explain. The gang. Just one job, and I'll have enough money to build me a nice jewelry store, or a mercantile, or both. Elizabeth will be pleased. Benjamin didn't know what to say. The Don Crawford gang was a bunch of outlaws that had terrorized California towns for years. Lawmen in Calico and the surrounding towns were wary of them, and for a good reason. They were notorious robbers, and there were rumors that they'd been responsible for several murders. Benjamin couldn't believe his friend was speaking about working for the gang so casually. You're working for the Don Crawford gang. Disbelief rang in his tone. Edward raised a brow as if he'd sensed Benjamin's disapproval and loathed it. It's better than spending the rest of my life toiling endlessly with nothing to show for it. The company pays little, and you were too much of an honest man to steal. Benjamin peered at his drink with sudden disinterest. Edward's tone was accusing, as if choosing not to steal was a bad thing. Still, his words had hit home. He had been working for years with nothing to show for it. Not that his job as a furniture repairer was any better. He went from house to farm rebuilding tables and chairs and helping to reconstruct paddocks and barns for busy farmers. It was a far cry from his dream of owning a furniture store. Honest men are poor. Benjamin frowned at Edward's words. His pa had been honest. He'd worked as a carpenter and had been able to build a small house where he'd raised Benjamin and his sister, Augusta. And he'd worked hard until the day he died. Edward seemed to notice his thoughtfulness because he lowered his voice and said, You can work for them too. It's nothing you and I can't do. A month from now, you can have enough to build that carpentry shop you've always wanted. The proposition tempted him. If he continued working, it might take him years to have enough to set up his business, if he ever did. If he took this job, however, what's the nature of the job? Benjamin couldn't believe his own words. What are we supposed to do? What do they do? Benjamin gaped at him in horror. You want us to rob? Edward looked a trifle irritated. Come on, Ben. How do you think the rich get their wealth? Benjamin decided he'd had enough. Everything in him revolted against the idea. He'd worked hard and clean all his life. He wasn't about to start towing the path of crime. Not now, not ever. He downed the last of his drink and stood to leave. I want no part in it. He turned to go. How do you intend to take care of your bride? Benjamin stopped in his tracks. He'd told Edward about placing an advert for a mail-order bride recently. He'd had high hopes for his furniture repair, and had decided it was time to get married. Now he wasn't so sure about his decision. How would he provide for a family with the little he had? Good night, Ed. The noise of the tavern disappeared as he stepped outside. The cold night welcomed him, and the chilly evening air raised the hairs on his arms. He strode past a few houses before turning a corner. The closer he got to his home, the more he was weighed down by thoughts of his unfulfilled hopes and dreams. A job? He scoffed. It wasn't a job at all. It was an invitation to a life of crime. His dear old pa would roll over in his grave if he ever did such a thing. He got to his house a short while later. A light flickered in the house. The door opened before he knocked, and Augusta stepped out holding a lamp. I was about to send out a search party for you. She raised the lamp to his face, and he squinted against the light. Where have you been? Benjamin brushed past her into the house. He was in no mood to be questioned tonight. His head swam with thoughts and alcohol. He collapsed on the couch. Augusta stood before him with her arms crossed. You've been drinking. The accusation in her tone annoyed him. Although she was only a year older than him, she acted like she was far older, almost like she was his mother. He wasn't in the mood to be scolded. All he wanted was peace and a way to clear his head. Benjamin shut his eyes, ignoring her. He'd drunk a little too much tonight. A feeble attempt at drowning his frustrations, that was what it was. Perhaps he'd also been carried away by Edward's generosity. Augusta moved the lamp so it lit up most of the room. The parlor was small and sparse like the rest of the house. It contained the bare necessities and little else. Augusta had recently added some new curtains, and, he suddenly noticed, some flowers. An attempt at beautifying their home. "Dinner's gone cold. I'll reheat it for you." Benjamin watched as she lit up the stove and bounded around the kitchen to get things ready. His irritation faded, and he felt remorseful for ignoring her. Augusta had suffered a lot in the past year. She'd lost her husband after 5 years of marriage and had no child to relieve her grief. He'd been so worried about her that he'd thought it best for her to move into the house so he could keep an eye on her. He ought to be kinder to her, no matter what mood he was in. A few minutes later, she placed a steaming bowl of soup before him. He didn't have the heart to tell her that he had no appetite. Under her watchful gaze, he spooned some soup into his mouth. "Ah, wonderful." Her lips spread, and her stern expression relaxed. She sat on a chair across from him and placed a cloth on her lap. On second glance, he noticed it was his shirt. She was attaching a button to it. Her gaze darted around the house, searching for whatever was out of place. Augusta thrived on activity. He often wondered if she distracted herself from her pain by focusing too much on unimportant things. "Have you asked for the loan?" Benjamin cleared his throat. "It's out of the question. Why?" "Collateral. You should take it. What's stopping you?" He grunted in response. Getting a loan at the risk of losing his house wasn't a risk he was willing to take. What would happen if he couldn't pay it back? It would have been an easier risk if he'd been living alone. Now that Augusta was with him, he was responsible for her. Soon he'd have a wife, another person he'd be responsible for. Benjamin pushed the plate away. For the second time, he doubted his decision. Was this the right time to get married? Would he truly have someone willing to stay with him despite his current situation? "You didn't finish your meal." Augusta stared at the plate with obvious displeasure. He drew the plate to him, not wanting to upset her. "I got lost in thought." The soup tasted bland in his mouth, but he didn't show it. Augusta watched him silently for a few moments before rising from the chair and entering her room. Benjamin drank a cup of water. Edward's words rushed back to him, and he felt torn. He had to choose his principles or his dreams. Chapter 3. Marriage? How dare he? Minnie fumed silently. She adjusted her blankets. She tossed and turned, mulling over Geoffrey's words and getting angrier with each passing second. After an hour of this, she gave up. Anger boiled within her. She loathed the situation her father's death had put them all in. Now a man they all despised had the right to his properties and their fate. With a loud grunt, she threw away the covers and stood from the bed. She threw the windows open. Moonlight flooded into the room. Outside, the world was gray and dark, just like she felt. She peered out into the night, ignoring the chill of the cold night air. "Oh, Father," she breathed. She shut her eyes and felt airy hands caress her skin. She imagined her father sitting beside her. His presence was a much-needed comfort in a time of uncertainty. "What do we do?" she whispered into the darkness. She was to be married off to Geoffrey's longtime friend, a 40-year-old widower who, Geoffrey claimed, had a profitable business and a large, comfortable mansion. Minnie had seen the glint of greed in his eyes and had read between the lines. He wanted to strike a deal with his friend, a deal where she'd be exchanged for money, status, or whatever else her cousin fancied. Minnie gritted her teeth. Her anger was pointless, and her helplessness sickened her. Rose had wept for hours until Florence had led her up to bed. Polly's eyes had grown large with fear and worry. Helen and Winifred had sat huddled together, whispering. Annie had sat quietly and kept mum. None of them knew what to do, not even Florence, who was always so good at coming up with solutions. They could either stay silent and accept whatever fate Geoffrey had designed for them, or face the consequences. Minnie bit her lip until it hurt. She hadn't expected him to summon her first. He'd insisted she marry first, a shocking decision since Florence was older. "You're the one he prefers," he'd said, as if they were dresses on a stack to be selected at random by interested patrons. "Sadly, I do not think you're a good choice. You're far too stubborn, and he'd prefer a more submissive wife." His gaze had drifted to Annie, and Minnie had quickly diverted his attention back to her. "I'll marry him." The words had tasted like gall in her mouth. She'd felt her sister's surprise, and Geoffrey's. He hadn't expected her to concede so easily. She'd done it for her twin. She'd rather subject herself to such a fate than let Annie take the fall. Recalling the events of the previous evening, Minnie suppressed the urge to scream. How dare he? Their father had never chosen for them. He'd brought some guests into their home in the hopes of spiking his daughter's interests, but he'd never forced his will on them. But now, someone else was forcing them into a life none of them had foreseen. "Minnie, are you awake?" Annie's gentle voice floated from behind the door. Minnie quickly opened it. Annie's face was tight with worry, and she hurried into the room with a lamp. She placed the lamp on Minnie's table, then flopped on the bed with a sigh. "I couldn't sleep a wink." She hugged herself. "It's so cold in here. Why did you open the windows?" Minnie shut the windows. They sat in silence for a few minutes until Annie said, "Now it's you. Soon it'll be my turn. I'm terrified. What if I don't like him? What if he's old?" She darted Minnie an apologetic look. "Sorry, Minnie." "It's not your fault I'm being forced to marry an old man." She managed to smile, feeling a little less angry all of a sudden. "He's so determined to get rid of us so he can do with our father's property as he wishes. What can we do?" Desperation rang in Annie's words. Minnie placed a hand on her sister's. "We won't let him do with us as he pleases." Annie looked doubtful. "What choice do we have? We have no claim on father's property." Minnie stiffened. "What?" Minnie shot to her feet. "Remember when father spoke to us in his study about marriage and trust? He mentioned our dowry." She started heading towards the door. "And now I remember walking in on him while he was closing a box I've never seen in the study." Annie carried the lamp and hurried after her. "You're saying our father put our dowry." "Shh!" Annie's voice dropped to a whisper. "In the study?" Minnie took the lamp from her. "It won't hurt to check." Although the thought was somewhat far-fetched, she wasn't about to let go of the little hope she had that things could turn out differently. They tiptoed towards the stairs. A series of loud, rhythmic snores came from their father's bedroom. Geoffrey had settled in far too quickly. "Pig," Annie muttered under her breath. Geoffrey's snoring trailed them down the stairs to the study. They paused at the door. Minnie sucked in a breath. None of them had entered the study since their father's death. It was too painful to feel his absence in the place he'd spent much of his time. She turned to her twin. Annie nodded, and she inched the door open. The room smelled musty as if they hadn't aired it out in ages. Minnie instinctively grasped Annie's hand as she stared at the empty chair behind the desk containing piles of books and letters. A loud thump from upstairs spurred them into action. Annie shut the door while Minnie hurriedly started searching for the box. "Where is it?" Annie whispered. Minnie got down on her knees and peered under the table. She found her way to an old shelf just beside the table, which contained all their father's books from childhood, including the ones he'd inherited from his father. Something caught her eye. An old box was partly hidden behind the shelf. She dragged it out. It wasn't as dusty as an old box should have been, she observed silently. And it wasn't just a box, either. A seal in front of the box resisted her attempts at opening it. She peered at it. It was a combination lock. Tiny letters were engraved on the lock in a random arrangement. She touched one, and it rolled downwards to portray another letter. "Try Peter M.C., Annie suggested, since it's only 7 letters. She rolled the wheels. The box stayed put. "Try the first letter of our names. Eldest to youngest," Annie said after a moment's pause. Minnie did as she said. The box opened with a soft click. 4 bundles had been placed neatly in the box. Each had a name written on it. Minnie reached for a bundle. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. Annie gasped. "It's right here. It's here." Minnie didn't know whether to laugh or cry, their last gift from their father. It was much more than money. It was freedom to make their own choice, a chance to start over, The sound of footfalls in the hallway snapped her back to reality. "Quick, grab the box." They hurried out of the study. Annie held the lamp while Minnie clung to the box. It was heavier than it looked, and she grunted with effort. She climbed up the stairs with less ease than she was used to. When she got to the top, she stopped. Geoffrey was waiting for them. Minnie held her breath. She waited for the inevitable. He'd yell at them, notice the box, and demand they tell him what was in it. The seconds crawled by as their only chance at freedom began to slip from their fingers. Geoffrey turned and walked down the hallway. "He's sleepwalking." Annie's laughter was packed with relief. They quickly hurried to Rose's room. Florence's surprise was clear when she saw them bustling in, holding a box. "Go get the rest," Minnie said. Annie slipped out the door silently. A few minutes later, they were all gathered in Rose's room. Rose lay fast asleep, oblivious to what was happening. "What is it?" Helen snapped, groggy-eyed. "I was just dreaming of Papa," Polly said mournfully. Minnie waved off their protests. "Look what we found." She opened the box. A collective gasp filled the room. The sisters reached for their father's last gifts to them. Each bundle contained a letter. Minnie's throat was clogged with emotion. She couldn't bring herself to read the letter. Not yet. It felt like her father had sent her a last message from beyond, wherever that was. "What do we do? Does Geoffrey know?" Minnie exchanged a glance with Annie. "We don't know," Annie said quietly. They were quiet for a long minute. For a second, Minnie doubted their decision to sneak in and take the box. What if Geoffrey knew of its existence? What would happen if he knew the box was with them? Winifred broke the silence. "We can take this money and go far, far away. We wouldn't have to do what he says or be stuck in a life not of our own choosing." Polly's eyes were wide with fright. "Isn't that dangerous? Where would we go?" They all turned to Florence. Rose roused from her slumber. She stared at them, groggy-eyed and befuddled by the gathering in her room. Florence placed an arm around her. "We can find a way to take back our inheritance." Minnie shook her head. "I'm the one who's getting married in a few months. The moment I say my marriage vows, it's over." She tightened her hold on her bundle. "I will not be forced into a life not of my own choosing." She wasn't certain how to do that yet, but she'd find a way. Her life depended on it. Chapter 4. The post office stank of sweat and dirt and ink. The townsfolk stood in a queue as they waited for their letters. Not for the first time, he wished he hadn't waited until almost dusk. Like him, others had looked forward to receiving letters all day and had eagerly rushed to the post office after long hours of work. His gaze moved from one man to the other. He wondered if anyone else was here with the hopes of receiving responses to their mail-order adverts. A man grinned as he rushed past, holding a letter in his grubby hand. Benjamin was almost certain that letter was from his intended. It gave him hope. Perhaps today he'd get a favorable response. The thought both excited and unsettled him. Murmurs arose. Snippets of conversation caught Benjamin's attention. He listened a while, eager to let small-town gossip distract him. "I hear the sheriff's caught some gang members the other day. Had them all locked up good, too. Serves him right for shooting a man dead." The exchange brought to mind his last conversation with Edward. Where was he now, anyway? He hadn't seen him in a week. Edward never bluffed. Whenever he made up his mind to do something, there was no stopping him. Benjamin knew that, and he hadn't tried to stop him. Now he wished he had. What if Edward had actually joined the gang? What if he'd gotten caught? He felt a spasm of anxiety at the sudden realization. Is it the Don Crawford gang? The men turned to him. Benjamin's words had escaped him before he thought too much of it. He just needed to know if his friend was safe. Despite their differences, Edward had been a good friend. It was unfortunate that his greed had led him astray. He couldn't imagine the pain Martha would go through if Edward was in jail, or how she'd feed their little children. He couldn't bear the thought of seeing his friend's children roaming the streets in old and dirty clothes. The Don Crawford can ne'er be caught. The day that happens, we'll 'ave a holiday. The man that spoke was so thin that he looked like a blast of wind would blow him over. He had a pencil-thin beard that graced a sharp chin and eyes as brown as the dark coffee Benjamin drank every morning. "I hear no one knows what they look like," the other, shorter man said. His bushy mustache wiggled as he spoke. Some people think they're a myth. I hear the gang's been around for decades, and not a single one of them has been caught. Not one. He spoke with an almost reverence for the outlaws. Soon, the men launched into a conversation about the heists that had been carried out by the gang and the number of victims they had. The excitement in their tone as they spoke sickened him. Benjamin drifted away from the conversation. He watched the queue shorten. He felt a rush of anticipation when he reached the front of the queue. The unsmiling clerk placed a small brown box in front of him. Benjamin couldn't believe his eyes. He'd entered the post office with half hopes, expecting to return empty-handed again. This time his hopes weren't dashed. Benjamin couldn't describe the extent of his joy when he grasped his letters. Finally, he thought, finally, he stepped out of the office. The fresh air was a relief from the heat of the post office. He spotted the sheriff marching past, his deputy rushing to keep up with him. He walked with more urgency than Benjamin was accustomed to seeing, like he'd truly captured a gang and wanted them tried as soon as possible. The men's words came to mind, and he wondered where Edward was. Had he truly become one of the outlaws, traveling from one town to the other and perpetrating evil? He felt a rush of shame as he remembered how tempted he'd been at Edward's offer. Benjamin had mulled over Edward's words for days afterward while he went about his daily activities, going from one house to the other to repair furniture, and every night before he slept. Although strong morals had revolted against the idea, his desire for wealth hadn't. He didn't have to be a part of the gang, he'd thought at first. He just needed enough money to start his furniture-making business. That was all. In the end, he'd tossed the idea away completely. There had to be a better way to achieve his dreams without becoming a criminal, and he'd find it. Benjamin stood outside the post office with several letters in his hands. Surprisingly, he'd gotten 4 responses. He hadn't dared to hope too much. The paper was dry in his palm. He turned the letters over, feeling a prickle of something he'd been battling with for days. Worry. His initial excitement had faded. Now, he came face to face with his sudden reality. He was getting a wife. The sky darkened ever so slightly. Someone brushed past him. The clerk was saying something about closing down the post office for the day. A heartbeat later, men poured out of the doors. Their faces were a mask of displeasure. Benjamin eyed the wooden structure. The tiny post office looked as if it could topple over at any moment. He thumbed through the letters, thinking of what to do. He'd never felt less ready to have a wife. And that was somewhat terrifying. Although a part of him longed for companionship, he couldn't help the doubt niggling at him. He didn't yet have enough to start a family. He released a long breath. After a few minutes, he'd decided what to do. He'd find a way to dissuade the women from corresponding with him, or he wouldn't respond at all. Pocketing the letters, he started heading home. The evening was cool, and a soft breeze had started to blow, sweeping dirt a half-millimeter above the streets. Benjamin watched a cowboy ride past atop a majestic dark horse. He imagined what it would feel like to own a horse, or 2, or a stable of horses. For a moment, he became engrossed in the imagination of what it would feel like to be wealthy, to never have to worry about making ends meet, a life where he could have all he needed and more, much, much more. Something hit his face. He snapped out of his reverie, annoyed. A little girl stood across the street with her hands clasped over her mouth. "Sorry," she shouted, pointing at the boy beside him. Benjamin's irritation faded. That was none other than Tabitha, his neighbor's daughter. Her clothes were faded and a little too small for her. Dirt streaked her cheeks. Her hair was a scattered mess of untamed dark curls. It looked like it hadn't been combed in ages. Watching her, Benjamin felt a twinge of sadness. She'd lost her mother a year before. Although they were poor, her ma had always ensured she was clean. Since her passing, the father, at a loss for how to care for a child, had turned to working hard and drinking. He couldn't fathom the extent of their hurt at losing someone who'd held the family together. The little boy picked up the crumpled piece of paper and skipped across the street to join Tabitha. A few other children were there, all dressed in old faded clothing. Benjamin's brow furrowed. Worry was nagging again. Years from now, would his children be dressed in old clothes several sizes too small? The thought left a bad taste in his mouth. He felt the weight of the letters in his pockets. Again, he was skeptical about his decision to marry. How good a husband would he be if he couldn't provide well? Tabitha waved a hand at him, calling for his attention. He beckoned to her. "Have you eaten?" It wasn't uncommon for her pa to have forgotten to feed her. Tabitha shook her head. Benjamin took her hand. He almost felt bad for leaving the other children. "Prosody rate percent. Where's your pa?" Tabitha skipped beside him. She was full of energy, as always. The 6-year-old frowned. She didn't stop skipping. "I don't know." She paused. "He might be working. Pa says he's always working." Benjamin kept her hand secured in his. He found Augusta on the porch. Her eyes softened when she saw Tabitha. "She's hungry," he said simply. Augusta took the child from him. She murmured softly to Tabitha. Tabitha warmed up to her immediately. As he watched them go, he wondered if taking care of a child would soothe Augusta's pain just a little. Maybe the loss of her family wouldn't hurt as much if she had someone to take care of, like she tried so hard to do with him. A few minutes later, Tabitha was wolfing down a meal in the parlor. Augusta touched her hair, sifting through the dirty tangles. "Where's her father?" she asked him in a low voice. Benjamin shrugged. "Who knows?" "Oh, the poor child." Benjamin hurried to his bedroom. He'd seen to it that Tabitha didn't go hungry tonight. Now he had an urgent matter to attend to. He sat on a chair and placed the letters on the table. Despite his doubts, he couldn't help feeling excited. If all went well, one of these women would be his wife. When he read the first letter, he forgot his decision to find a way to dissuade the women. Her words were cheery and reflected a sweet personality. After reading the first letter, he had high hopes. Perhaps he'd marry a preacher's daughter from Philadelphia. Then he opened the second, and he completely forgot about the preacher's daughter. "Dearest Benjamin, I found your advert quite fascinating, and I decided to respond immediately with my intention to be your wife." Benjamin blinked. He was slightly taken aback by the boldness. She'd cut to the chase right away. "I spent a night poring through the matrimonial times. No advert caught my attention as much as yours. Not even close. The honesty in your words was quite endearing, and I made my decision to send a letter immediately. Forgive me if you spot an error or two, but I am quite drowsy from lack of sleep, and there's only so much flickering candlelight can do. From your letter, I can see you are hardworking, devoted, and family-oriented. Those are traits that my father always told me to seek in the man I'm to marry. Before we go on, I suppose it's only right for me to introduce myself properly. I'm Minnie MacPherson, the second of 7 daughters. My father used to say if I were a man, I'd make a good lawyer. I loathe injustice, every form of it. I'm good at math and I can keep house. I have many younger siblings, so I'm quite skilled at taking care of children. I'm not very good at playing the piano, unlike my twin sister. Nor am I much good at chess, although I have a feeling my non-existent skills wouldn't be needed. As the second of 7 daughters, it is imperative I marry early, and even more so since my father's death recently. Of course, I do not intend to rush into a marriage without being fully certain of the characteristics of my intended. I hope that in time we shall get to know each other properly. It'd be wonderful if our acquaintanceship could culminate into a lasting marriage. With hope, Minnie. Minnie's letter was a hurricane that swept him off his feet and returned him to the same spot. Benjamin stared at the letter. There were no flowery words. She was direct and bold, almost brazen. Somehow, he liked it. He read the third letter, but he hardly took notice of it. Minnie's words were embedded in his mind. He'd completely forgotten his decision to resist the urge to begin a correspondence. He ignored the growling in his belly and searched for a paper to write on. When his ink touched the paper, he was smiling. Dear Minnie, he wrote. He'd made his choice. Chapter 5. Benjamin O'Reilly. That was his name. Minnie felt a rush of warmth as she stared at the letter in her hands. He'd asked her to marry him. Truthfully, she hadn't merely crossed her arms and waited for him to realize they were a match. Theirs was a whirlwind romance, with a clear goal right from the start: matrimony. Their correspondence had been brief. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that she was here, on her way to Calico, California, to be the wife of a furniture maker. Far from her cousin's evil clutches and the unwanted wedding that had hung over her like pregnant, dark clouds. Thankfully, she'd found an escape before it rained. At the thought of her cousin, she felt a spasm of fear. She'd kept under the radar for months while she carried on with her plan for escape. She'd curbed the urge to stand up to Geoffrey, even if it had meant biting her tongue so hard it had almost bled. She hadn't argued when he'd insisted on bringing her groom over for dinner. She'd been polite, gracious even. Geoffrey had been pleased. He'd exchanged knowing smiles with his friend as if to say, "Didn't I tell you she was a dear?" She'd played the part to perfection. She'd fought her cringe when she'd placed her hand in John's sweaty palm at a request to go on a stroll and be better acquainted. And she'd gritted her teeth as he droned on and on about his many achievements and how fine his wine collection was. Oh, it was a nightmare. But now she was out of it. Minnie released a breath, feeling a familiar constriction in her chest. She'd been carrying around a heavy load for weeks. Every time Geoffrey summoned any of them, she'd been terrified he'd learned of the money and had wanted to force the truth out of them. The sisters had made it a point to meet every night in Rose's room to discuss their plans. So far, they hadn't been able to come up with how to get their father's estate from Geoffrey's clutches. Maybe they didn't need to. All they needed was to get their life back, to be able to make their choice instead of letting someone they loathed impose his will upon them. Minnie clasped her hands together. The train had stopped. She was here. She'd done it. She'd escaped Geoffrey. She'd escaped the miserable life she'd have had as a wife of a sour and drab old man. Passengers started milling out of the train. The sound of stretches and groans and stifled yawns filled her ears. She glanced out at the streets, filled with strangers. Her relief was tinged with apprehension. What would happen to her sisters now that she was away? What would Geoffrey do to them? She'd been afraid he'd force her twin to marry the old man in her absence that she'd almost decided to stay. The night before her departure, she'd almost changed her mind. "If you don't go, you'd be stuck." Annie had spoken with more force than she was accustomed to. "You'd have to marry him, and you'd have to take orders from a man you despise for the rest of your life, well, until he dies." Now here she was, clinging to the hope that her departure wouldn't put her sisters in a worse situation than they were already in. The next few minutes passed in a blur. Minnie held on to her trunk, trudging through the crowd of people on the platform. She fought her apprehension as she searched for a dark-haired man amongst the townsfolk. It didn't take long for her to find him. Their eyes locked, and for a millisecond, the crowd disappeared. Her apprehension melted, and she all but floated towards him. He was handsome. Not ruggedly handsome, like she'd expected, but handsome. His hair was combed neatly to the back, revealing the angles of his marvelously carved features. Startling blue eyes held hers. For a moment, they reminded her of her father's, warm and kind, with a depth of fathomless wisdom. His clothes looked like they'd been washed too many times. He wasn't dressed in a Sunday suit and a fedora hat, nor was he riding atop a magnificent horse. But she didn't mind. This was her groom. This was her choice. "Benjamin," she said, flashing a grin. His pupils widened noticeably. He seemed immensely pleased by her appearance. "Minnie." His voice was low and as smooth as honey. She watched as his lips curved. Crow's feet formed at the corner of his eyes as he smiled. Warmth spread to her toes, and she felt a tingle down her spine. When she placed her hand in his, she just knew it. She'd made the right choice. He led her to a coach waiting just a short distance away from the platform. They sat alone in the coach while the driver coaxed the horse to move. They sat silently. Are we? They looked at each other and smiled. "You first," he said. "We're getting married?" His smile spread slowly. "I." He hesitated. "Unless you don't." No. She rushed to reassure him. "We agreed." She shut her eyes briefly, letting it all sink in. It had been agreed. She was getting married. She didn't feel the overwhelming burden of an unwanted duty on her shoulders, nor did she feel disgusted by her husband-to-be. She glanced at Benjamin from the corner of her eye, tall and broad-shouldered, just how she'd envisioned her husband to be. His hands looked like they belonged to a man that earned an honest living. He seemed kind, too. Marrying him was the right choice. The wedding was a brief affair, far briefer than what she'd have had at home. Far better, too. When it was time to kiss the bride, Benjamin hesitated, silently asking for her permission. She braced herself. Shutting her eyes, she waited for the feel of his lips on hers. Her heart beat faster as his face neared hers. She held her breath, parting her lips ever so slightly. His lips touched hers for just a second. She opened her eyes. It was over. Her heart sank in disappointment. Was that all a kiss was? Then she glanced at him and saw a burning in his eyes. A spark of desire that was somehow foreign and familiar at the same time. And it dawned on her at that moment that she was no longer a MacPherson. She was now Mrs. O'Reilly. She was married, and she was free from Geoffrey's tyranny. Benjamin's hand was warm around hers. The priest's instructions sounded far away as she looked into his eyes. "Take great care of your wife," the priest said. A look crossed his expression. His face darkened slightly, and he looked away from her. Anxiety rose within her with every passing second. Her post-marital excitement had been too brief, like their kiss. As they stepped out of the priest's house, it suddenly dawned on her that she had fled her home to marry a man she hoped she knew well enough. She thought of the woman her father had married and his disappointment when he'd found out about her deception. "We've finally gotten that over with," Benjamin said, distracting her from her thoughts. His hand tightened on hers. "I'd have loved to show you around town, but I know you must be tired from your journey." In her anxiety, she hadn't realized how tired she was. The roller coaster of emotions had dulled her to her fatigue. Now that she'd achieved her aim, it was all right to relax. Tomorrow will be good. She leaned back. It'll be lovely to take in the view from this comfortable coach. Benjamin's face changed. "I don't own it." He dropped his gaze as if ashamed by his admission. Minnie didn't know what to say. She'd assumed he owned the coach. If he didn't, how did he get around town? Perhaps he had a horse. That would make sense. She'd seen more horses than coaches pass by since she got to town. She placed a hand on his. "I wouldn't be able to have a proper look at the town through a coach anyway." His smile was watery. The coach pulled to stop in front of a small house located in the middle of two even smaller houses. A rickety old chair was perched on the narrow porch. A half-finished dress had been placed neatly on the chair. A needle was stuck in it. "This is my home," she heard Benjamin say from behind her. The coach started moving again, without them this time. A few seconds later, she was mounting up the short stairs to her new home. It was a far cry from her father's Victorian-style house. The parlor was small, very small, only half as large as her bedroom. It contained 3 plain old chairs, a table, and little else. A corner had been segregated as the kitchen, and a door led to what she expected to be the bedroom. She surveyed the house silently, at a loss for words. She hadn't thought much about what houses were like on the frontier. She hadn't cared. But now, standing in a small parlor barely the size of her father's study, she realized she should have cared. "You don't like it." Benjamin was watching her intently. He was a bit pensive, although he tried to hide it with a casual posture. He leaned against the wall with his legs crossed before him. From a few feet away, she saw his body stiffen, and she knew that whatever she said would determine the course of their marriage. So she forced a smile and said, "It's home." Chapter 6. It's home. Benjamin tried to see the house through her eyes. He wasn't fully aware of the type of life she'd had. She hadn't gone into too many details, but he was certain it was better than this. A lot better. Watching the surprise on her face, he couldn't help feeling like he'd deceived her in some way. It was obvious from her reaction that this wasn't what she'd expected. He'd sensed her disappointment when he'd admitted to not owning the coach and how quickly she'd covered it with a smile. She was doing the same again. She clasped her hand in front of her. "Well, I might as well make myself comfortable, since I'll be living here a while." Although the smile was still on her face, he could detect her unease. He felt it too. He wondered if she was already regretting getting married to him. He wondered if he should have taken her to his home first before going to the priest's. But he hadn't, because a part of him had selfishly wanted her to be his bride. Come what may, he only hoped she felt the same. Her gaze on his was expectant. She was waiting for a response. "I'll put your trunk right over." The door burst open. They turned to the doorway. Augusta took a hesitant step into the house. Her gaze landed on Minnie, then on him. "You didn't tell me we were expecting a guest." She flashed a welcoming smile at Minnie. Taking note of Minnie's appearance, her smile slipped. Benjamin understood why. Minnie's bright yellow dress distinguished her from the townswomen, who wore dresses made from calico and dyed to whatever color they fancied. Minnie was dressed in a proper Sunday dress, with lace trimmings and flowery patterns. Augusta's washed-out blue dress paled next to hers. "Minnie, this is my sister. Augusta, meet Minnie, my wife." Augusta's mouth went slack with shock. Her eyes widened, and she looked at him as if he'd gone mad. "Your wife?" She opened and closed her mouth. "You got married?" Benjamin winced at the accusation in her tone. He'd intentionally kept all news of his correspondence with Minnie away from her. He hadn't wanted her prying into his business and trying to manage his private affairs, as she so often did. It was quite tiring. He only hoped Minnie's presence would force her to become less involved in his life and more involved in hers. Minnie looked confused by Augusta's reaction. "You didn't tell her?" her expression seemed to say. He hadn't told her much about Augusta, just that she lived with him. Minnie hadn't seemed to mind. In fact, she hadn't minded when he'd honestly told her about being a furniture repairer who was still looking for ways to start his business. She hadn't seemed bothered then, yet her reaction when she'd seen his house had been one of utter disbelief. Had she expected him to live in a mansion? Minnie took a step towards Augusta. She held out a hand. "I'm Minnie." Augusta eyed her. "Why have I ne'er heard of you?" Minnie's smile slipped. She raised a brow at him. Both women were staring at him. Benjamin cleared his throat. "We got married immediately she arrived. That's all there is to know." "You got a mail-order bride?" Benjamin got defensive. The distaste on Augusta's face irked him. He noticed Minnie's face cloud. The tension mounted with every passing second. "You have your pick of good women here, yet you went as far as—" Augusta paused and turned to Minnie. "Where are you from?" "New Hampshire," Minnie said flatly. Augusta raised her palms. "There's a— Augusta." Benjamin shot her a warning look. He'd expected her to be displeased. Still, her disapproval gave her no right to be disrespectful to his wife. Minnie grabbed her trunk and left the parlor quietly. Benjamin leveled a glare at his sister. If she noticed his glare, she showed no sign of it. "Who is she? I can't believe you brought a stranger to the house. And then you married her without my consent." Benjamin strove to curtail his annoyance. "I don't need your permission to get married, Augusta. I chose her. She chose me, and we got married." Augusta shook her head. "I'm older than you. Not by much, but I am older. And I'm wise enough to know that getting a mail-order bride is not a good decision. You don't know her. What if she's running from something? What if she's committed a crime and she needed a place to flee? What if she's lied about who she is?" Benjamin emitted an exasperated sigh. Augusta's overprotectiveness was extremely tiring. He sat on a chair, hoping she'd lower her voice and do the same. "Augusta, you may or may not like it, but that is my wife, and I'd like you to accord her respect." Augusta's eyes narrowed. She crossed her arms. She looked more like an insufferable child than a grown woman. "You had better choices, Benjamin. You could have married Ruth." Benjamin grimaced. Ruth was Augusta's childhood friend, although she was 2 years younger. She'd been smitten with him for a while, but he'd pretended not to notice. Ruth was loud and overbearing and wickedly cunning. He'd never fancied her. "I can't marry Ruth." "You could have." He ignored her. "I've already married Minnie." His eyes bored into hers. Finally, after a long silence, she uncrossed her arms and sat down. "People aren't always what they seem, Benjamin." Her eyes held an expression he couldn't fathom. "I don't want you to get disappointed, or worse." He patted her hand. "Minnie is a good woman, I assure you. Her presence in his life would only make things better." He only hoped she wouldn't leave because her expectations hadn't been met. Benjamin shot to his feet and approached the door to his bedroom. His new wife was waiting. Chapter 7. Augusta didn't like her. Although she didn't say it outright, Minnie could sense it in the way Augusta looked at her when she thought she wasn't looking. The scowl she wore whenever Minnie was in the room, and the expression of disapproval while carrying out daily tasks. In her eyes, Minnie could do nothing right. Minnie quickly learned to give up any hopes of bonding with her sister-in-law. It was a bit hurtful, since she'd thought a friendship with Augusta would alleviate some of the longing she had for her sisters. Settling in hadn't been easy. It was hard enough getting used to life in a small town. in a tiny house that had none of the luxuries she'd had at home. There was no study where she could relax and read a book, no piano to play, even though she wasn't good at it. Most of all, there was no sound of her sister's rapturous laughter. That was the worst part of all. She missed her sisters so much that it hurt. She'd never been separated from them, ever. Minnie sucked in a breath. Her heart felt hollow. Try as she might, she couldn't shake off the feeling that all was not well at home. Her hand poised on the paper, she started to write. "I'm worried. You haven't written back to me. Is everything all right? Did you get my first letter? I'm safe and happy. My husband is quite the gentleman. He's kind and wonderful," and Minnie paused. She watched the curtains sway slightly in the mid-morning breeze. Benjamin was kind. He'd been nothing but gentle with her since they got married. Yet she couldn't help noticing he wasn't completely open to her, as if he expected her to walk out the door any moment. "I'm not at ease. For your sake. I really have to know. What's happening at home? Did Geoffrey go into a fit in my absence? Annie, are you all right? Is he forcing you to marry John instead of me?" Guilt hung over her as she wrote the last line. If Annie was forced to marry the man she'd run from, she wouldn't forgive herself. Gradually, she'd come down from the high of fear and excitement she'd been on since the days before her journey to Calico. And now, when her eyes had cleared, she couldn't help thinking whether or not she'd made the right decision. Perhaps her decision to leave had been good for her, but what about her sisters? "Oh, stop it," she chided herself. She continued writing. "I miss you so. I can't describe how much I miss having you all around me. Is this how it will be? Will we all be separated forever?" A sob welled up in her throat. She was so far away from them. Would she ever see her sisters again? None of them had been able to see her to the station. She'd left before dawn and had felt an alternating urge to flee and return at the same time. She shut her eyes and dropped the feather. Writing home was harder than she'd thought. Rose's sweet, tear-streaked face lingered in her mind. Minnie's sight was heavy. She peered outside the window. Someday, she vowed, she'd see her sisters again. "We don't sit around doing nothing around here." Augusta's voice startled her. She was standing in the doorway with a scowl on her face. "We don't have servants to do all the work while we sit around painting our lips." Minnie strove to control her annoyance. The first time Augusta had noticed her wearing rouge on her lips, she'd scoffed and shook her head. Since then, she hadn't hesitated in referring to it whenever she could. "I've done all that needs to be done." She tried to conceal her irritation. Augusta's open disdain for her was very disconcerting. Augusta eyed her. She said nothing for a while. "I came to get Ben's gray shirt. It needs a button." Minnie stared at her, unblinking. Augusta acted as though she saw Minnie as a threat, which was completely ludicrous. "I'll fix the button," Augusta scoffed. Prosody raked her tent. "And prick your tender little fingers? I fix his shirts. I've always done." Minnie wanted to lash out. "He's my husband." But she curbed her tongue. Her anger was her shortcoming, her father used to say. "Pause before you react. Think first," he'd said often. Minnie inhaled deeply. She was married now. She had to act more like the mature woman that she was. "Augusta," she started calmly, "I know you're used to doing things for Benjamin, and that's wonderful. However, I'm his wife. I'll fix his shirts." Augusta stiffened. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step into the room. "Who do you think you are? You just hop down from a train from God knows where, marry my brother, and think you can take over. Benjamin and I looked out for each other for most of our lives. When Ma died, I was there for him. I took care of him. I fixed his shirts. I won't let a woman I don't trust try to replace me." Minnie was startled by her rage. Words rose to her throat. Augusta's voice had risen by an octave, and she glared at Minnie like she was dirt stuck to a shoe. "I'm not trying to replace anyone. I am his wife. You're his sister." She crossed her arms, refusing to be intimidated by Augusta's larger frame. "It's only proper for me to perform my wifely duties." "You're not his wife. He'll soon see that." Minnie threw her hands up in exasperation. She was sick of Augusta's ridiculous insistence. "What have I done to you? Why can't you accept the fact that Benjamin has a wife now?" Her voice had matched Augusta's. Shamefully, she realized their argument was loud enough for neighbors to overhear. "I don't trust you. You're hiding something. I'm sure of it." Her eyes pierced Minnie's with an intensity that made her speechless. She floundered, searching for words. I don't know what you're talking about. Your correspondence was ridiculously brief. You only exchanged letters twice before you prompted him to invite you to Calico. At Minnie's gasp, she smiled smugly. I read your letters. I had to know. My brother might be too blind to see it, but I do. Why were you in such a hurry to marry him? What are you running from? Minnie struggled to swallow the lump in her throat. Geoffrey's damning words floated in her mind. You're getting married in 2 months. A shudder ran through her when she recalled John's touch and the leer on his face. And then her sisters, sad and pensive, all afraid of the day it'd be their turn to be married off in exchange for whatever Geoffrey wanted. And the money in her trunk. She forced herself to look Augusta in the eye. Nothing. I'm not hiding anything. Augusta didn't believe her. She shot a glance behind Minnie and shook her head. He shouldn't have married a stranger. He should have picked Ruth. I told him, but he wouldn't listen. Her words trailed away as she disappeared. Minnie flopped on the chair, deflated. Her heart beat so fast that she thought she'd faint. What did Augusta know? If she knew the truth and told Benjamin, it might not end well. She only hoped he'd forgive her if he found out the truth, that she was almost another man's bride before she was his. Chapter 8. Benjamin couldn't believe it. Standing before him was none other than Edward, in new clothes, a different haircut, and handing a majestic dark horse to a shorter man. Benjamin gaped at him. It had been 2 months since he'd last seen Edward around town. There had been no sign of him, and Benjamin hadn't gone to his house to pay him a visit. Their last conversation had made him unsure of where they stood. He hadn't wanted to be treated like an uninvited guest. Edward turned. His face morphed into a smile, and he waved. Benjamin's tension eased. He approached him, grinning. "Where have you been?" He scanned Edward's clothes and suddenly wished he hadn't asked. There was little doubt where he'd been. Benjamin wasn't sure what he'd done, and he didn't want to ask. It was better not to know. "In search of greener pastures," was Edward's cryptic response. "Ah?" Benjamin nodded. Edward spread a hand towards the uninhabited expanse of land before them. "I decided to check on this land before I start building my store." He flashed a self-satisfied grin. "I just got this land and this horse." He slapped the horse's flank. "A beauty, eh?" Benjamin couldn't speak. He stared at the land, then at Edward's new horse. Plastering a smile on his face, he suppressed his envy. "Great news." Edward's grin seemed to have been permanently glued to his face. "Martha's pregnant again." This time, Benjamin's smile was genuine. "You won." They made small talk, and both men pretended their last discussion had never happened. It wasn't until Benjamin was returning home that he felt the full force of envy. Edward had gone ahead with it, and he hadn't gotten caught. Most importantly, he'd returned with enough money to buy a horse, own a piece of land, and build a store in just 2 months. Benjamin was so lost in thought that he didn't immediately hear someone calling his name. Then he wished he hadn't. "Ben?" Ben groaned inwardly. He wasn't in a great mood for company, least of all Ruth's. She didn't look very pleased to see him, which was odd considering the fact that she'd called his attention. She was plain. Her hair was an unruly mass atop her head, and her nails were stained with dirt. She had none of the sophistication that came so naturally to Minnie. "I heard you got married." She shifted her feet. Her displeasure was apparent. She looked at him with a hint of disappointment in her expression. "You married a stranger." Benjamin's smile was tight. Her eyes flashed. "Augusta told me she's a mail-order bride." She said the words with distaste. Benjamin didn't humor her. He didn't want to engage in another round of excruciating small talk. He ended the conversation politely and hurried home. His mood improved when he thought of Minnie. Marrying her, despite his initial doubts, had been a great decision. It was wonderful knowing he had a wife to go home to every night. He was about to reach the house when he saw Augusta step out of the neighbor's house. Tabitha embraced her with a big smile. Augusta patted her cheeks and said something to Tabitha's father before turning to return home. She froze when she saw him. "Benjamin," she appeared somewhat flustered. "I didn't know you were friendly with Tabitha's pa." The family had moved in after Augusta had gotten married, so Augusta hadn't known them, until now. "Tabitha invited me in after I gave her some lunch." He could have sworn her cheeks turned red. He blinked, surprised. Then she cleared her throat. Plus, I wanted to give your wife the space to perform her wifely duties. Her tone informed Benjamin that something had happened in his absence. I suppose it's high time we knew how good of a cook she is. Benjamin shook his head. He entered the house after her. Minnie welcomed him with smiles. His heart melted. Even with sweat on her face and her hair in a mess, she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. She started trying to arrange her hair. He stopped the gesture and planted a kiss on her lips. Minnie giggled. Dinner's ready. After she'd served him, she sat down to watch him eat. Why aren't you eating? She shrugged. No appetite. Something crossed her face. Sadness or wistfulness, he wasn't sure. He was about to ask when she forced a smile and asked how his day had been. Benjamin grimaced when he remembered Edward and his ill-gotten wealth. Although he was ashamed to admit it, he was envious. Edward had decided what he wanted and done what it took to make it happen. While he stayed in a small house, working menial jobs and hoping things would change. If he continued this way, he'd toe his pa's path and work for meager earnings until his death. Augusta sat at the table, ruining the moment. Have you gotten the loan yet? Minnie glanced between them, confused. What loan? Augusta ignored her. Benjamin pushed his plate away. He quickly realized the innocuous gesture could cause Augusta to gloat and hurt Minnie's feelings. Minnie didn't seem to have noticed. She was waiting for his response. I was thinking of getting a loan to build a furniture store. Minnie's expression softened. Oh, she bit her lip. Her expression was thoughtful. A loan. He's refused to get it, Augusta said. She spooned some food into her mouth. She made no reaction. Benjamin didn't want to talk about the loan. He didn't want to think about Edward or his problems. The only thing he wanted was to spend a quiet evening with his wife. He reached for Minnie's hand. She stood abruptly. Excuse me. Benjamin watched her go, mystified. Silence fell at the table. Your wife? I don't want to hear it. Augusta looked as if she wanted to argue. Instead, she shut her mouth and gave him a look. All right, when the high is over, I hope the scales come off your eyes. Benjamin finished his meal hurriedly. Minnie still didn't return to the table. After dinner, he entered the room, expecting to find her asleep. Instead, she was on her knees, placing something at the bottom of her trunk. She gasped in shock when she saw him. She froze. Are you all right? Minnie hurriedly squeezed her belongings into the trunk. She pushed it under the bed. Benjamin frowned. Why hadn't she unpacked fully? Did she have plans to leave? I was looking for something. Minnie's laughter was nervous. He watched her intently. She seemed unsure, as though she was hiding something. It unsettled him. Then she came to him, and his doubts disappeared when she touched him. Minnie placed her head on his chest. He wrapped his arms around her. She sighed deeply. What's troubling you? My sisters. I miss them so. He drew circles around her back. She relaxed against him, and his thoughts from before suddenly seemed ridiculous. She wouldn't leave him. She was right here in his arms because she wanted to be. Is Augusta causing you any trouble? Minnie stiffened. It's nothing I can't handle. She withdrew from his embrace. I don't understand why she's against our marriage. She's always been so protective. Too protective, I'd say. She's always looked out for me since we were children. Pa worked long hours, so it was mostly Augusta and me. He sat on the bed. She did the same. Then she lost her husband a few years after they got married. Oh, Minnie's eyes shone with sympathy. Maybe she thinks you'll hurt me in some way. I've always included her in everything I do, except this. Perhaps she feels threatened. Benjamin wished he'd informed Augusta of their correspondence earlier. It would have made things easier for Minnie. If there was one person he understood, it was his sister. She loved having control, and her husband's unforeseen death had shaken her to the core. So she'd focused her attention on the things she could control. Unfortunately, that had included his decisions. I want both of you to get along. You're both my family. Slowly, Minnie nodded. I'll try, she said. He held her to him. Her heart beat in sync with his, and he kissed the top of her head. Truly, it was wonderful to have someone to wrap his arms around. His thoughts drifted to the trunk beneath the bed. Whatever she was hiding, she'd tell him in time. He just had to trust her enough to wait. Chapter 9. Minnie inhaled Benjamin's scent as she leaned into his embrace. She pulled away. I know. You have to go to work. Benjamin stroked her cheek. I wish I could take you with me. Minnie's heart sang. It was moments like these when he stared at her with so much longing in his eyes that she was assured that she'd done the right thing by marrying him. His hand lingered on her cheek. Finally, he left for work. Minnie's happy bubble burst just as quickly. She'd written a third letter, and her siblings had still not responded. It was becoming quite worrisome. Minnie bit her lip, staring into the lively streets. Something was going on at home. It was scary not knowing what was happening. If she'd stayed, she'd have gotten married to John a week ago. She pictured herself in a large house, listening to his droning voice go on and on about all the things he owned. Her relief was short-lived, however. Life with Benjamin was a beautiful dream, despite Augusta's dislike and the awfully small house. He adored her. And for the first time, she knew what love felt like. Yet she couldn't shake off the guilt she sometimes felt at her own happiness. Yes, she was happy, but at what cost? What was happening back home? Minnie was about to hurry inside to change her clothes when she remembered Calico was a far cry from back home. She didn't have to be dressed in all finery for a brief trip to the post office. She didn't bother telling Augusta of her whereabouts. Her sister-in-law would be too busy fussing over Tabitha to notice her absence. The little girl had been spending more time in their house. Augusta had even made a dress for her. Those kind gestures made her seem completely different from the woman that was so distrustful of Minnie. Minnie slipped out of the house. The warm smiles and eager greetings thrown her way elevated her mood significantly. Calico was a friendly town. She'd made a few acquaintances since she'd arrived, including the storekeeper and an old woman living just beside their house. Fortunately, there was no queue at the post office. She'd gotten there before any other person. She made a beeline for the clerk and asked if she had any letters from home. The seconds that ticked by were long. Minnie held her breath, hoping for some good news this time. Ah, of course. Her hands shook slightly as he handed a missive to her. She'd gotten a letter. Her sisters had written back. It took all her will not to tear the letter open in the post office. She hurried home, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. She was half afraid Annie would have been forced to marry instead of her, or that Geoffrey had found a way to punish her sisters for helping her flee. Or if he'd found out about the dowry. She stopped in her tracks. The dowry. Benjamin had caught her checking for it in her trunk the night before. She'd tried to cover up her shock by being affectionate, but she'd seen the curiosity in his eyes. She'd stood there for ages debating on what to do. Her husband needed a loan for his business. She had more than enough to set them up for a good start. If she handed him the money, what would she tell him? She'd all but forgotten about the money. She'd chosen to bury it in the recesses of her mind, along with many other things. Augusta's comment about the loan had reminded her. Minnie still wasn't certain of what to do. She could tell him her father had given her the money for when she got married, but that might not be believable. Plus, if that had been the case, why hadn't she said a word about it from the start? There were so many things to consider. She was afraid Benjamin would see through her and know she wasn't telling him everything. "Thank you for your kindness." Minnie turned to see Augusta in front of Tabitha's house. This time, she wasn't speaking to Tabitha, but to an older man with long brown hair and dark eyes. Minnie stood watching them, curious. Augusta giggled at something he said, and Minnie's mouth fell open. Augusta could giggle? She'd never even seen her smile. It seemed she always had a scowl on her face whenever Minnie was around. Careful to avoid getting caught spying, Minnie quickly hurried into the house. She sat on a chair and tore the letter open. The words jumped at her. "Dear Minnie, I'm sorry I wasn't able to respond to your letter quickly. After you left, Geoffrey kept a close eye on us. Indeed, it was so intense that we could hardly breathe without his permission. Of course, he accused us of helping you escape and even threatened us if we didn't tell him where you'd gone to. None of us said a word. Even Rose, who caves in so easily, was as hard as stone when he glared and yelled at her. She wasn't intimidated into speaking. If you'd been here, you'd have been very proud. I miss you very much. We all do. Sometimes, whenever Geoffrey makes some ridiculous statements, We look at each other and wish you were here to respond. You were always the quick-witted, sharp-mouthed one, as Father used to say. I do wish you were here to speak up like you often did. Florence has instructed us to refrain from saying something that would rile him. She says if we don't offend him, he wouldn't be threatened and punish us as much. I'm certain you're scoffing at that statement right now. Well, we've decided to take Florence's advice. Not that it's helping matters. Geoffrey has been quite pensive since you left. He's been going out more often, after he'd assigned more servants to watch over us. Your old groom came here the other day. Helen tried eavesdropping, but she couldn't make out all they said. The only thing we're certain of is that they had an argument. John made a puzzling statement. Find her or else. We don't know what he means. It seems Geoffrey is in trouble for something. I honestly hope he is. I know you might be afraid that John has set his eyes on me instead. Geoffrey did make that option available. I felt as though ants were crawling over my skin when he ordered me to the study and paraded me before the old man. John took a look at me and said it was the other twin he wanted. I almost retched when I got out. You should have heard the way they spoke about us like ordinary dolls to be auctioned off. Well, it appears your groom is too besotted by you to pick someone else, which, thankfully, is a relief. Yet, I can't help being afraid. What if the man he picks for me is worse? Oh, Minnie, I'm sorry for ranting on and on about what's happening here. That's quite selfish of me. I'm thrilled to know you've married a good man. Excited, even. We all squealed happily when we read your letter. He sounds like an absolute dream. I'm glad you're happy. It makes this situation more bearable. The money we found has given us a semblance of hope. Winnie has this grand plan of us running away together to start a different life in a new city with different names. Her grand ideas make us laugh. Every day, I'm afraid Geoffrey would find out about the money we stole, and his anger would be piqued. He's furious enough by your absence as it is. If he has any idea, a letter from home, I see. Minnie snatched her gaze from the letter to see Augusta peering at her curiously. Minnie folded the letter, wondering how she hadn't noticed Augusta's entrance. Wordlessly, she stood and headed for the room. She felt Augusta's eyes on her back. The letter in her hand weighed a ton. When she returned to her room, she finished reading the letter. Annie's troubled tone worried her. She followed the letter's instructions and unfolded another paper. It was a newspaper. There, in black and white, was an image of her splashed across the papers, with the words "Missing Bride" below it. Tragedy has struck another blow. Minnie MacPherson disappears 2 weeks before her wedding day. The MacPherson household, who recently lost a dear father, has been thrown into shock concerning the sudden disappearance of the second daughter, Minnie MacPherson. Several attempts have been made to find her, but none has yielded fruit. Her guardian, Geoffrey MacPherson, has promised a sizable sum to whoever gives him a true report of her whereabouts. It is his sole desire for her to return home safely. Her loss is deeply felt by her 6 sisters and a groom who's been pining for her return. Oh no, this wasn't bad like she'd feared. This was worse. Much, much worse. Chapter 10. Benjamin saw the triumphant look on Augusta's face and knew something was wrong. "What are you doing here?" He was working on Edward's construction project. He'd been dubious when Edward had asked him to help with the building and had almost turned it down. Then he'd thought of Minnie. He couldn't let his pride stand in the way of his progress, plus the pay was good. He'd be able to afford some new things and have some saved for the future. Augusta scanned the uncompleted structure. "This belongs to Edward?" Disbelief rang in her tone. He heard her unspoken question. Instead, he chose to focus on the reason she'd interrupted him at work. "Did something happen at the house? Did you quarrel with Minnie?" Augusta scoffed. "That's for you to do." She held up a letter. "Look what I found." Benjamin shot her a dubious look. "What's this?" "The truth." Her smile was gloating. "No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't have hidden the truth from me. I'd have found out anyway." Benjamin eyed her suspiciously. "What are you talking about?" She thrust the letter into his hand. "Read it. You might want to sit down for this one." Benjamin was puzzled. The letter was from Minnie's twin. He read the first letter. Seeing nothing worthy of suspicion, he looked up. "What's this? You were prying on my wife?" This is a personal letter. You had no right to go snooping on her belongings. He handed the letter to her. I have work to do. Augusta didn't back down. You read the first part of the letter, didn't you? You wouldn't have collected it if a part of you wasn't suspicious. Benjamin turned to the shelf he was building. Augusta's overbearing attitude was going out of control. He hammered a nail into the shelf, hoping she'd take the hint and leave. Instead, her voice rose above the hammering. Don't you want to know what's at the bottom of her trunk? Benjamin stilled. What are you talking about? Augusta's smile was mocking. I found something in her trunk. Benjamin exhaled forcefully. You had no right. Money, a lot of money, more money than I've ever seen. Benjamin stopped. What? He noticed someone approaching and pulled her farther away from the others. What are you talking about? You'd have to see for yourself. Did she tell you about the money? Benjamin didn't say a word. Augusta took his silence as an answer. She wouldn't, because she'd have to tell you where it was from. She stole it, Ben. Benjamin was stunned, speechless. He shook his head. Nay, she's lying about something, about everything. Benjamin refused to believe it. Yet there it was, the answer to the question that had started ringing in his mind since he'd seen Minnie sifting through her trunk. She'd been hiding something from him, he'd sensed it, but he'd trusted her enough to not jump to conclusions. Read the letter. Benjamin stared at the letter. If he took it, everything would change. Reading it meant he was admitting to not trusting her. It meant that, even if Augusta's accusation was wrong, he'd let himself be swayed into doubting Minnie. He hesitated. Augusta moved the letter as if daring him to decline. He took the letter. He shouldn't be snooping on her privacy like this, yet he couldn't overcome the need to know, to confirm if Augusta's claim was true. Benjamin's hand shook as he read the letter. So many questions arose in his mind. Who was Geoffrey, and why did Annie write of him with so much distaste? When he was done reading the letter, it finally dawned on him. Minnie was a runaway bride. Have it. His voice was shaky, laced with disbelief. He couldn't believe all he'd read. Minnie had fled home just a few weeks before her wedding, and she'd stolen some money before running to Calico to marry him. Minnie hadn't been an eager mail-order bride desperate to wed her groom. She'd used him to escape being punished for a crime, and to escape whatever man she'd almost married. Benjamin's throat was clogged with emotion. He shut his eyes briefly, feeling the sting of betrayal. Who was Minnie MacPherson, and why had she married him? I'm sorry, Ben. Augusta's tone was soft. I know you're fond of her. Fond of her? He loved her. He'd enjoyed every moment of feeling her in his arms, of kissing her, inhaling her rosewater fragrance as she lingered in his embrace. He'd loved seeing her in pretty dresses he could never afford, thinking how lucky he was that a woman like her had chosen him. Benjamin clenched his jaw. Maybe she hadn't chosen him. Maybe she just needed a place to lay low for a while until the storm was over before she left him to pursue whatever life she wanted. Nay. He shook his head. He wouldn't conclude so hastily. He'd go home and confront her and hear whatever she had to say. Then he'd know what to do. Where are you going? Augusta called after him. He didn't wait for her. He almost stomped past Edward. Done for the day? Benjamin didn't stop to talk. I'll be back. I have urgent matters to attend to. He had to know for himself if the woman he'd married was the same person that had hidden such big secrets from him. He needed to know. When he reached the house, Minnie was nowhere to be found. The house was silent. He called for her, but she'd disappeared. He almost thought she'd fled. Then he saw her trunk under the bed and felt a surge of relief. Despite what he'd found out, he didn't want her to leave. It would break him. He stared at the trunk for a long minute before he finally pulled it out. He sifted through the clothes and books until he found a stack of cash underneath. He placed the wads on the floor. He stared at it, unable to believe there had been so much money underneath his bed. Something glinted. A ring, an expensive one, by the looks of it. Benjamin hadn't been able to afford a ring. He'd used his mother's ring, an old thing, but one that he'd cherished. It was nothing like the diamond-encrusted ring in front of him. Footsteps alerted him to her arrival. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. He kept his eyes fastened on the things on the floor, the money, the ring, the letter, the secrets she'd kept from him. What are you doing? It was Augusta that spoke, not Minnie. He could almost taste his disappointment. He wanted, more than anything, for her to tell him the truth. He wanted to ask her about it all. Where is she? Far away from here. He frowned. What do you mean? Augusta hesitated. I took care of it for you. Her tone was unsettling. What did she mean by that? Where is Minnie? Augusta gestured to the paper on the table. You'd have found out sooner or later. Benjamin grabbed the paper. His jaw went slack with shock. A picture of Minnie stared at him with a short report on the missing MacPherson. Missing? What is this? She lied to you about everything. Her cousin is a powerful man. Sooner or later, someone was bound to recognize her and inform her cousin of her whereabouts. A strong feeling of unease curled in the pit of his stomach. What did you do? His voice was deathly calm. I did you a favor. I helped you get rid of a liar and a thief, and I won you a sizable sum that would go a long way in helping you start your business. Blood roared in his ears. He clenched his hands into fists. Augusta didn't seem to notice. I was doing you a favor. If I hadn't, someone would have, and her cousin is powerful enough to twist it all and send you to prison for stealing her. She was grasping at straws to prove her point. We're poor. They're wealthy. The whole world would believe them. Eventually, you'd have lost your freedom for a woman that has proved to be untrustworthy. You had no right. He'd had enough. He closed the distance between them. Surprised, Augusta took a step back. I have tolerated your meddling enough, Augusta. I've been patient with you because of the loss you've suffered, but no more. You've meddled far too much. I was only trying to protect you. Augusta's eyes shone with tears, the way I always have. Benjamin fought hard to control his temper. Stop trying to protect me, Augusta. I'm not a helpless little boy anymore. He wanted to say more, but whatever he said would hurt her. Instead, he stepped past her and headed towards the door. She'd be long gone by now. What? Augusta looked at him with tear-filled eyes. Geoffrey, he said he'd be in Calico today. Minnie is already gone. Chapter 11. Minnie took one look at the clerk's face, and her heart fell. There was no letter for her. Disappointed, she left the station. She'd spent a long time waiting for nothing. Not a word from home, not since she'd replied to the last letter. She'd written a reply the very day she'd received Annie's letter. The urgency in the last part of the letter had bothered her. Had Geoffrey started asking questions about the money they'd stolen? Was he truly planning something despicable for her sisters? They didn't know. She didn't know. And that was terrifying. Knots formed in her belly. She heard the whistle of the train. Watching passengers spill out of the train, she thought back to when she'd arrived in Calico. Her anxiety had been at its peak, and her doubts had curbed any excitement she should have felt for being a few breaths close to meeting her groom. Minnie felt a longing to return home, even if it was for a little while. The idea was foolish. If she returned, Geoffrey would pretend she'd come back to her senses and marry her off, despite the fact that she was already married. She'd be in more trouble than she already was. Minnie was so caught up in her thoughts that she paid no heed to the stagecoach drawing closer to her. The vehicle stopped. This is where you've been hiding. Minnie went cold. There, sitting inside the stagecoach, was Geoffrey. Her mouth fell open. What was he doing here? She blinked. Again. It was none other than her cousin. She took a step back. He quickly reached out to grab her hand. Minnie struggled against him, but he was stronger than she was. How did you find me? She managed to ask when she'd found her voice. Grinning mischievously, he spread a paper open before them. An image of her was splashed on it, with a price attached to whoever would find his dear cousin and return her safely home. Minnie didn't have the strength to feign surprise. Imagine my surprise when I received a letter from Calico about my cousin's whereabouts. He folded the paper neatly. From a Mr. Benjamin O'Reilly. Her breath ceased. She didn't notice that the stagecoach had started moving, nor did she think of what he'd do now that he'd found her. His last words rang in her ears. Over and over. Her husband had written a letter to Geoffrey? Geoffrey seemed to have noticed her shock. You don't believe me? He pulled a letter out from his pockets. Clearing his throat, he started to read. The words burned Minnie's ears and dug a hole in her heart. She wanted to cover her ears and deny it. She wanted to hurl herself out of the moving vehicle and return to Benjamin, but she was rooted to the spot. The words came at her, escorted by distasteful victory from Geoffrey's gloating tongue. I deeply apologize for not sending this letter sooner. Had I known who she was, I would have written earlier. It came as a shock to me when I made the recent discovery that my wife, Minnie, was none other than the runaway bride in the papers. I wouldn't have married her if I'd been aware of this from the start. I'm an honorable man, and it's highly dishonorable to marry a woman who's run away from her groom. It pains me to do this, since I've come to care for her dearly, but I know this is in everyone's best interest. With time, she'd have tired of a simple life in a simple town and longed for the life she would have had with her groom. I shall sign the annulment papers and do whatever needs to be done. In return, I ask for the cash prize promised. No, Minnie shook her head violently. He'd never do that. Oh, but he did, Geoffrey spoke in a sing-song voice. That goes to show that men want money. All men want money. He barked a laugh. Minnie's lips quivered. She bit her lip, willing herself not to cry. She would not break down in tears in front of Geoffrey. She refused to give him that pleasure. Geoffrey peered out of the coach. He waved someone over. When is the next train leaving? Wonderful. He turned to Minnie with a grin. We'll be out of this stink hole in half an hour. I'd have preferred a long bath and a day to rest, but there's very little comfort this town can provide. He wrinkled his nose. Surely you're not upset over this matter? He has nothing to offer you. You should have married John earlier. You wouldn't have had to suffer as much. His ramblings didn't penetrate Minnie's haze. She was in a daze. Her husband had betrayed her. He'd turned her back to her uncle for money. In a flash, she recalled the pain in her father's eyes when his second wife had deserted him with a chunk of his wealth. He'd opened his heart to another woman, and she'd broken his trust. A tear rolled down her cheek. She quickly wiped it off. Then she remembered her dowry. She sat up. I have to get my trunk. Geoffrey shot her an odd look. That's not necessary. I have to get my trunk. Minnie was almost hysterical. Benjamin had fooled her. He'd tricked her into believing he cared for her, then he'd sold her out to her uncle. She recalled the way he'd looked at her that night. He'd known, he'd suspected she had something valuable, and he'd seen for himself. Then he'd found Annie's letter and the paper, and taken a step that made what he wanted fall easily into his lap. Minnie struggled to breathe. Her heart hurt so badly that she felt she wouldn't survive it. She'd be stuck in a marriage to a man she loathed, whilst Benjamin spent her dowry on establishing his business. She, Minnie MacPherson, had been fooled by a man into believing he loved her. She'd lost. Her shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her. A sob escaped her throat. Benjamin? How could he? She wanted to speak to him one last time, to hear if it was all true. Then she remembered how kind she'd thought her stepmother was, and how cunning she'd turned out to be. There was no need for confirmation. So Minnie sat in the coach, numb. She peered out the window and watched the townsfolk go about their daily tasks. The world seemed to whiz by in a blur of activity, while she sat there, her heart breaking into smithereens. She didn't notice when Geoffrey got tickets for their ride home. The next thing she knew, she was boarding the train that would take her back home. Even the thought of seeing her sisters again did nothing to lift her mood. You'll thank me for this. Geoffrey seemed more pleased with himself than usual. Despite how much he pretended to be concerned for her well-being, she knew it was only a hoax. All he cared about was whatever shady business he had with John. He'd never cared for anyone but himself. She was staring dismally out of the train when a familiar figure caught her eye. Running towards the platform was none other than Benjamin. She sat up. Despite her hurt, she felt a strong compulsion to go to him, to hear whatever he had to say. But she kept herself in check. Geoffrey was reading the papers and munching loudly on something. She tried to tear her gaze away from the platform, but she couldn't. Benjamin appeared frantic. His gaze roamed the platform. He was looking for her. Why would he be looking for her if he didn't want her? Then slowly he looked at the train. The world went still as they locked eyes. His expression said it all. She took one look at him and knew there was no way he would have done such a vile thing. Benjamin didn't have a cunning bone in his body. The whistle blared. Minnie's heart raced. Benjamin already looked defeated. His shoulders slumped, and the gut-wrenching pain on his face made her heart clench. Her breathing became shallow. If she didn't go now, if she didn't find a way to bypass Geoffrey and return to Benjamin, that was the end. She'd have truly lost. She glanced beside her. Geoffrey's eyes were closed, his mouth was slightly parted. He'd dozed off. She shot to her feet. She'd taken a few steps away from him when he clamped her arm with an ironclad grip. "Where are you going?" "Let me go!" Minnie raised her voice. "Let me go!" She noticed all eyes on them. An idea occurred to her. There was nothing Geoffrey cared for more than his reputation. He was powerless against a mass of people coming to her aid. "Let me return to my husband." Minnie ensured she was speaking over the sound of the starting engine. An old woman turned and glared at Geoffrey. "Let her be, you oaf." She hit him with a book. "Let her be." Geoffrey was distracted enough for her to snatch her hand from his grip. She took a step forward. Then she fell into Benjamin's arms. "Ben?" Her tone was breathless. He pulled her with him, and they ran out of the train. They'd just stepped onto the platform when the train started to move. His hands cupped her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her heart beat so wildly. She couldn't believe she'd escaped Geoffrey. The whistle blew, and the train pulled away from the station. Geoffrey glared at her with so much hate that she was shaken. She took a step closer to Benjamin. He embraced her. They held each other for what felt like hours. "I can't believe I almost lost you," Benjamin said. "I'm sorry for not telling you. I thought, shh, it's okay." He hugged her and stroked her hair. She inhaled his masculine scent, and her heart started to heal. "What happens now?" Benjamin held her hand. "We'll go home, and you'll tell me everything." He held a hand to her face. "Do you trust me?" Minnie paused. "Yes," she said. "I trust you." Epilogue. Marry a man you trust, Minnie's father had told his daughters several times before he died. He'd taught them that love was not complete without trust. He'd learned that the hard way, and he'd never opened his heart to another again. Minnie stared out into the streets. It was exactly 6 months since her father's passing. She still held his words in her heart. They'd guided her on her journey over the past months and led her to a place where she was finally truly happy. She hummed a tune as she passed a needle through her husband's shirt. She was fixing a button to his shirt, a chore she'd grown to enjoy. She sat on the porch, watching the sky turn gray as the leftover colors of sunset faded from view. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Augusta stood at the doorway. "I see you're getting the hang of it." Her attempt at friendliness didn't go unnoticed. After she'd almost been forced home by Geoffrey, Augusta had profusely apologized for what she'd done. She'd impersonated Benjamin and masterminded a way to send Minnie home. She'd written the letter, not Benjamin. Benjamin had been furious. Some harsh words had been exchanged, and for the first time, she'd seen Augusta cry. Although they were far from being friendly, there was none of the tension they used to have in the past. It had taken a while to get used to Augusta's painful politeness. She still hadn't become fully accustomed to it. "I've packed everything else I need." 2 bags lay at her feet. Minnie was glad she was moving out. It was time she finally enjoyed some real privacy with her husband. She didn't want Augusta breathing over her neck anymore. "Congratulations on your marriage," Minnie said honestly. She hadn't been too surprised when Augusta had announced her intention to marry Tabitha's father. It turned out that her budding friendship with Tabitha's father had woken him to his duties as a father. He'd stopped drinking so much, was doing well at his job, and returning home earlier each day. Minnie wouldn't be surprised if Augusta had bossed him around and forced him to clean up his life. Augusta might be forceful and domineering, but it was for a good cause. She was fiercely protective of those she loved. "You can come for dinner sometime." Augusta's face betrayed her surprise. "Aye," she cleared her throat. "That'll be nice." She disappeared from view. Augusta acted as though she was traveling to another town when her new home was just 2 houses away. Minnie's joy was boundless. Finally, she couldn't wait for Benjamin's return and the good news that he was sure to bring. She'd eagerly given him her dowry. He'd been against it at first, but she'd convinced him to use it to establish his business. Benjamin was swift to act. He chose a spot close to the larger houses, hired some builders, and started working on starting his store. His dream had grown bigger. He'd make and sell furniture for the new houses and inns that were sprouting up in the town. It was sure to be a profitable venture. Already, He'd caught the eye of a renowned merchant who was planning to build a boarding house. Benjamin appeared with a huge grin. He lifted her into his arms and twirled her around. "I got the contract." His eyes shone with glee. "I got it." She kissed him. I had no doubt. Benjamin removed the band holding up her hair. He liked her hair down, and he always enjoyed running his hands through it. "I have to hire a few good furniture makers. That'll make the job faster." Minnie fluttered her eyelashes. "Did I ever tell you I had a knack for carpentry?" Benjamin's chest reverberated with laughter. "In that case, you're hired," she giggled. "You doubt what I can do." "Oh, I know the things you can do." His eyes glinted with mischief. "But that's not one of them." Minnie squealed as he suddenly swept her up in his arms. They were about to enter the house when he stopped. His expression became sober. "I got a letter for you from the post office. I think it's from Annie." Minnie's smile died. "Let me see." She took the letter from him and hastily tore it open. The words jumped at her.